From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Here's what's coming up. K-State's Dan O'Brien offering his latest take on the grain market trends. He'll comment on how long he thinks the havoc brought on by Hurricane Ida may resonate in the markets, and he'll look ahead to the USDA's next World Grain Supply and Demand report out next week. Also, K-State's Ignacio Ciampitti will go over a simplified method of estimating the expected yields from a given soybean field. It allows you growers to arrive at a reasonably accurate yield estimate by sampling a manageable number of plants within the field. And awaiting with the latest on Kansas agricultural weather, K-State's Mary Knapp. That and more straight ahead on this Agriculture Today. Tuned in to Agriculture Today, our Friday edition, which opens up on the grain markets, and the weather is back in the limelight in a different way this week, and we'll get into that and more with Dan O'Brien, Mike's side, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. Referring there, Dan, to Hurricane Ida. And for agriculture's purposes here, the crop damage that's still being tabulated, the infrastructure damage to the movement of agricultural products and goods, it's a mess.
It is. And with the September supply-demand estimate report due, I believe, September the 10th, I think, this shortfall that'll have come in at the end of August and the very beginning here of September on exports just brings up the question of, well, first of all, what will we see in terms of old crop adjustments? Again, that marketing year for corn and for soybeans and grain sorghum ended well on August 31st. That was the old one, new one coming in. So you'll probably see some bit of shortfall the last week or so impacting that, and at least a slower pace to start the new crop marketing years for those crops. Now, wheat, interestingly, you're about 13 weeks into that marketing year, so what's slowed down now will come in, likely come back. To borrow a term from our livestock animal science brethren, I wonder about compensatory gain, with the idea that come the time when we are able to move grain through those Gulf of Mexico ports, and acknowledging that there's been some that's been effectively sent off through the Pacific Northwest. So given all of that, I would wonder, and would anticipate that once those ports are open, that we'll have fairly strong demand to try to catch up. And mainly because, again, South America, the main competitor for us is on the tail end of its availability of some of these crops, and in some cases didn't have as much as they were thinking for, especially second crop corn for Brazil. And we have river issues at the Pinar River affecting both Argentina and Paraguay's shipments. So it would seem that although we're slowed down right now, that just as soon as we get electricity and repair of damages, that we could return to a pretty brisk pace and even maybe a compensatory gain on the back end of that. At least that's my thought, because the world does not have abundant other suppliers around. So what we see now in the corn and soybean futures, corn down from a week ago, it closed yesterday. September, of course, September's in the delivery period. September 5.16 and a quarter. D's corn, now the lead contract at elevators, as we rolled over to that contract, and the delivery period for September at 5.25. November beans at 12.83. And when you look at cash prices for selected locations across the state, we have corn prices have dropped quite a bit here of late. And I think that probably has to do with, again, this quick demand pull that we were anticipating as harvest came in with exports moving out. So I guess in trying to figure out where things might go at this time has given a negative shot to the market at the same time that we anticipate harvest is just around the corner. Mm-hmm. So I said earlier, I think there'll be a time of compensation on the other side. So if that comes in 3 weeks, in 4 weeks, well, that'll be about October 1. If harvest comes through pretty strong, then you could see some returning strength, at least in basis in Kansas. Now, we'll see. You make those statements like that, basis for corn, basis for sorghum. It is interesting to me. You and I have been watching ethanol bids at different states throughout the United States. We watch it every week.
And something odd has happened here, you say.
There was a time when Kansas had the highest bid, again, of the range across all these states for corn going into ethanol plants. And here the bid on Thursday, September the 2nd, yesterday, was 572 3/4 is the top end bid. There was a range of 512 3/4 to 572, and that is tied with Minnesota as the lowest bid, the lowest top end of these bid ranges for literally any state in the U.S. And here you've got Nebraska at 655.5. Michigan 662, Ohio 695, 682 3/4 in Indiana, $6 in Illinois. So areas that have great crops coming on in the Eastern Corn Belt almost surprisingly have pretty strong cash price bids. And obviously they're just caught short, waiting for the new crop to come. So just a challenging set of things. And we've talked about the one big factor that's affected things, again, Hurricane Ida coming in and affecting some key ports and the likelihood of return to normal function some weeks away, frankly. So that's one factor, but there's several others also going.
But we are anticipating, again, a week from today, Dan, that USDA monthly grain supply and demand report. This will be the first time that we see results from actual USDA crop enumerators out in the field taking measurements and putting some numbers together on our crop domestically.
Well, I think the thing to remember is that a week from today, when they report those numbers for the supply-demand estimates, they'll be relying on a crop report that would represent basically September 1st, September 2nd, September 3rd crop conditions. So what's out in the field right now in the field surveys? I also saw a news release that came out that the USDA in the September report was planning on doing something that they don't normally do, and that's to look at harvested acres. So what has brought that on? Well, probably the problems up in the northern states. They're wondering about crop abandonment up there. So normally they wait till October. That they're coming in here on this is a big issue. You've been hearing and talking with our colleagues up there that actually the yields for what is harvested up there are not that bad. But the other side of the coin is that we're harvesting less acres than we would normally do. So that in itself, it's probably a factor that may be driving the USA to want to bring in earlier than normal this acreage adjustment because again the strong yield reports that they're getting on less harvested acres could distort what the real picture is on the size of the U.S. corn and soybean crops.
If we might, Dan, talk about wheat for a second once more. In advance of fall planting, we're getting closer all the time now, but the Risk Management Agency has now put out its number, if you will, by which wheat coverage will be based and indemnities paid to producers if that is a necessity. And that number is very much in keeping with the loftiness of the market itself.
It's got a 7 in front of it. The number listed for the average of July 2022 hard red winter wheat futures for the period of August 15th through September 14th came in at an average of $7.12. So let's say a person buys 75% APH coverage. So for your acres times that 75% APH coverage, you are 100% covered. But for the other 25%, following the kind of the logic of Art Barnaby from years past, take that full coverage on 75% of your acres and spread it out over 100% of your acres. You basically take the 712 times 0.75 and you end up with $5.34. So I understand that the 712 looks attractive, but what's the coverage overall? Well, I get 75% APH, it's $5.34. If you buy to 80% APH or 85, well, they're going to pay a lot more for insurance, a fair amount more money, but they'll be insuring a higher price. So you kind of have this issue going on, I think, of the marginal cost of buying up on your insurance and comparing that to, say, forward contracting or buying options or marketing strategies along those lines. So it's a little different way to think on and look at the cost structure of the crop insurance that we're buying. So again, if you buy up, you're buying something, you're buying more revenue coverage. How much is it costing you per bushel? And if you were going to do something else to buy that type of coverage, buy some put options or go do some hedging, then you've got a number to compare against the cost of other risk management strategies on the price side anyway.
But this contributes to the lingering discussion how much wheat will be planted this fall and whether we will see acreage climb to the upside.
In my own thinking, I wonder how farmers in Kansas, anyway, will respond to wheat relative to its competitive crops. The price drops that we've just seen on corn for these other crops come at a time where it's probably advantageous for people to look towards wheat as they've seen what has just happened in the market, so what one storm can do to drop things. So I'm there's a La Nina that's occurring right now, projected impact plantings in South America, and that's happening this fall. When Elwing Taylor came to visit us at Risk and Profit Conference several years ago, he said our primary crisis times happen when a La Nina sets in and stays around. Then that's when we have blocking high-pressure systems. And are we saying that that's going to happen? No, we're not. But you do have these things rummaging around. And again, I think for the sake of the usage industry's imbalance with the sellers, that we need great production and good prices, so that everybody can be sustained and then the whole system can move forward together. $9, $10 prices, if that came and we started to knock out ethanol plants and livestock feeders and exporters, you'd do great in the short run, but then you'd have to hopefully see those industries recover to be able to maintain the corn market. Yeah. So that's sort of at least my own philosophy towards this.
Equilibrium has its value in all of this.
Yeah, we all need to work together on this stuff, I guess.
Dan's notes on the markets, of course, are posted on the agmanager.info website for your review, producers, so take advantage of those. Dan, thanks for coming over.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
That from grain market economist Dan O'Brien, K-State Research and Extension. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network. We're back now on Agriculture Today and motoring ahead toward the latter end of the soybean production season now. There might be opportunity for you producers to put together an estimate of your field's soybean yield potential. That was the topic of an article recently in the Agronomy E-Update newsletter series and authored by our guest now. He's on the road as we speak, Ignacio Ciampitti, crop production and cropping systems specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Ignacio, the first thing to bring up here, when would be the preferred time to make an estimate on a soybean field's yield? Are we to that point yet?
Well, thank you, Eric, as always, for the invitation.
Sure.
We always say that, usually when we are looking at yield estimates, and we usually discuss on corn many times, we try to go after flowering because we know that we define a lot of the yield at flowering time for corn. And then when you think about that, if we have the current number, we can start making an estimate. We always know that the seed size is our unknown factor, but we always have good correlations if you look at the number of kernels and the potential yield for corn. On the soybean side, it's not that straightforward as to go to flowering because in many of the situations at flowering time, we have very small plants. And then we need to start thinking about when is the optimal time. We still need to have pod numbers, and that's probably the earliest that you can just move to make estimates. We usually say if we are in pod formation and if hopefully we finish all podding, then we have an opportunity to start making those estimates. Now, to be more precise, we need to get as close as possible to harvest. So the question is how early or how late you want to do it. I will always say that if we have a possibility to do it around this time of the year, we will have a much better chance of getting close to the final value because we are already going through the seed filling, and then that means that in many situations, we know exactly how many pods we have in the plant, and then we probably can get a kind of a rough, good estimate on what are the potential number of seeds on that plant. This is one of the things that we need to understand. If we go really early, we have less certainty of the final values. Wow. As we get closer to the end of the season, we are increasing our values and uncertainty. If we can pass seed filling, and if we are doing the seed filling when these pods start filling with the seeds and we can start counting seeds inside of the pods, that is a good moment to start making those estimates.
And when making these estimates, you say that there are a couple of approaches here, a conventional approach and a simplified one. Which one should one opt for?
We usually talk about two approaches because the conventional approach was to look at the total number of pods per acre, and that usually is by counting plants and by counting pods per plant, which in many situations when you talk to farmers about this, they kind of like look at you and saying, number of plants, number of pods per plant, come on, man. And then when you look at the seeds per pod, we can get a sample and look at what would be roughly the seed numbers. But what we proposed was something a little bit simpler than going through all those steps, rather than just to go on counting plants and counting pods and then making an estimate on seeds per pod and then trying to make an estimate on the overall pounds per bushel. From there, the question on bushels per acre. We go with a kind of a simplified approach. The simplified approach, it calls to do kind of like a small sampling. So rather than going in the situation of sampling multiple areas of the field, we just go with a different approach here, that we are only sampling small sections of the field. What we are saying is 21 inches if you are in a 30-inch row spacing. In 21 inch, you have 1 over 10,000 of an acre in that area, which means that if a farmer was planting or targeting 100,000 plants, in 21 inches, we will be counting 10 plants. And that seems a little more feasible.
Right.
And we want to move in this direction because we want to make sure that farmers are doing more areas. We don't want to make an estimate that only reflects the best area of the field. We want to make an estimate that reflects the variability of the field.
Right.
So by keeping it simple and by doing small areas, we wanted to propose asking farmers to sample more, to make sure that we can get more areas in the field, to sample the variability.
So how to go about this much more condensed, simplified approach here? You mentioned the 21 inches of row length. There's other information that will be gathered within that scope. You might go through that if you would.
Yes. The first point is, like I mentioned, to be clear, that if you are in 30-inch row spacing, that is looking at one row only. If you are in 15 inches, then you are looking at 2 rows. If a farmer is on 7.5 inches, then you are looking at 4 rows. Overall, you will be counting the same number of plants. So if you are targeting 100,000 plants, you will be counting 10 plants all the time. And then if you want to go through the driving forces, the first one is the total number of pods per acre. So one of the main things that we need to do is to start counting pods. In those 10 plants, the main aspect is to count the most uniform plants that represent the section of the field. We can count between 3 to 5 plants and trying to get that total number of pods per acre, basically, to get what is the total number of pods per plant first. We can then multiply that number with the basically number of plants per acre that we have in that area. And then the second step is to look at the seeds per pod. In average, in soybeans, we have 2.5 seeds per pod. We say that range between 1 and 4. We can start looking at the different sections of the plant and start looking at the pods. And then most of the time we're trying to make an estimate. Usually you will see for many farmers that number will be between 2 or 3 seeds per pod. And that will give us the number of seeds per acre, because now we have seeds per pod, pods per plant, and the plants per acre. Okay? The last component, which we usually call the unknown, is the seed size.
And that's the more difficult, you say, Ignacio. It's more elusive.
Yeah, it's the most difficult because in many situations it's a very nice guess. Why we say that is because we say the seed size usually can range from 2,500 to 3,500 seeds per pound, okay? That is basically what happened in many situations. And to be quite honest, in many situations when we do the estimates, we are doing it before the end of the season. So if we have a situation of drought or any stress condition impacting at the end of the season, most likely we will be getting a small seed size, very lightweight seeds. And then the numbers that we need to use to make the estimate are those. So what we usually say is that we are using like a factors. If you are in a normal growing season, we tend to use this 2,500 that is normal to large seed weight, seeds per pound. And if we are in a very droughty season, we usually tend to use the larger number because that means that we can put more seeds in a pound. So we have smaller seeds, 3,500 seeds per pound. And usually we just refer to these numbers as as a factor. We usually, if you look at the update article that got published last week, we say that we have a conversion unit for large seed size that is 15, and if we have a stress condition, we have a conversion unit of 21 seed factor. So after we get this, basically what we do is that we just plug all these numbers into the equation: number of plants, pots per plant, seeds per pot, and then we divide by the seed factor. So with that, if you want to be conservative, you can just play with the seed factor, since it's one of the unknowns, and try to get like a range. And 1 point disclosure here, soybeans seed weight, it really contributes to the yields, and usually the contribution to yield is between 30 to 40% of the final yield, which means that, the last couple of weeks during the growing season for soybeans are critical to define if a farmer will get 60 bushels or if a farmer might finish getting only 40 bushels. So when we're doing the yield estimations, we also need to be thinking on this, because it's an estimation and we're trying to be as close as possible, but we also need to be realistic based on the forecast and the future weather that we are planning to have in the next coming weeks. So as the soybean plants are getting to the end of the season.
At the very least, this gives the grower a representative idea of the likely yields from a given soybean field if they follow this process. By the way, as Ignacio says, is fully outlined in an Agronomy e-update article, which we'll point you to in just a moment. But you would encourage producers to go ahead when it's opportune for them. Take a look at what's going on out there, use this method, and get a handle on what they might anticipate the harvest will look like at the end, Ignacio.
Yes, I think that it would be excellent for many of the farmers. The yield estimation is just an excuse for many of us to go out to the field and also to look at the crop, just doing these exercises and looking at the variability in the crop in different sections. Be realistic, trying to be conservative, and hopefully the yields will surprise you at the end of the season.
The full formula, again, is in that article, Estimating Soybean Yield Potential. It even has an example or two to fully illustrate how it can be beneficial to you producers in giving you a notion of the likely yield from that field. This was in the Agronomy e-update newsletter this past Thursday, the 26th of August. Have a look at that at agronomy.ksu.edu. And Ignacio, thanks for taking a few moments to pass that along to us right here.
Thank you, as always, Eric, for the time.
That's Ignacio Ciampitti. He is a research and extension crop production specialist here at K-State. Agriculture Today will be back in a few moments on the K-State Radio Network. Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Today's agricultural news headlines in brief for you now, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, grain companies with terminals along the lower Mississippi River continue to look at shifting more of their committed grain and soybean exports to ports in the Pacific Northwest, while damage assessments and repairs begin in earnest following Hurricane Ida. As DTN reported earlier in the week, the power outages to refineries are expected to have a widespread ripple effect on gasoline and diesel prices nationally as well. So far, there have been few assessments of the impact of storm damage on crop production in Louisiana or other states in the path of the storm. More details to emerge as roads become passable and power is restored to affected areas. Now, the Mississippi River is the major export channel for corn and soybean exports. The port of South Louisiana is the country's leading grain shipping port, moving 1.7 billion bushels of soybeans and 1.5 billion bushels of corn last year. That translated into about 65% of the country's soybean exports and roughly 55% of corn exports. Ports in the Pacific Northwest, meantime, do ship some corn and beans, but are generally more more geared toward wheat exports. Still, CHS Incorporated said it's working to divert export shipments scheduled through the next month to its terminal in Kalama, Washington, after Ida knocked out a transmission line that powers its Myrtle Grove facility south of New Orleans. And Cargill reported it had damage at its West Wego, Louisiana terminal, a 4.3 million bushel capacity facility, and its Reserve, Louisiana facility, which has 6 million bushel capacity. And again, the assessment continues of what the storm named Ida left in its wake when traveling across the eastern U.S. this week, including what areas in its path were spared of significant damage. Here's more from the USDA's Rod Bain.
After a 5-day trek across parts of the eastern half of the U.S., Ida's impacts include in the landfall area of Louisiana and Mississippi.
A lot of the hardest hit areas have been difficult to access. Power remains out, roads are closed, and there was considerable lingering flooding in the wake of the system.
And beyond that, according to USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey,
the interaction between the remnants of Ida and a cold front generated some extremely heavy amounts of rain from the central Appalachians into the northern mid-Atlantic and southern New England,
resulting in catastrophic flooding in parts of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York State, and potential ag impacts in those areas. Yet some fortune was found in that
Ida turned a bit to the northeast before reaching the major crop production areas of the Mississippi Delta.
And in the Tennessee Valley,
the rainfall was not particularly heavy, so areas that had been flooded less than 2 weeks ago were spared another flood event.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
On the brighter side, this year is turning into a much better than expected income year for agricultural producers, according to a leading USDA economist. Here's more from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
This year, U.S. farmers will likely generate net cash income far above last year, 21.5% above at $134.7 billion.
The highest level since 2014.
That's Spiro Stefano. He runs the USDA's Economic Research Service, just out with its farm income forecast for this year. And unlike a year ago, when government payments contributed a huge amount to farmers' incomes, more than $45 billion, this year those payments will drop by almost 39%. Stefano says this year the dollars are coming mainly from the marketplace.
Farm sector cash receipts forecast to increase about $64 billion. That's an 18% increase.
Cash receipts will top last year for most products.
And particularly large increases are forecast for corn, soybean, and hog receipts.
In fact, hogs will account for about 71% of the increase in farm cash receipts. Among the livestock products, dairy is the only commodity expected to see lower receipts, down about 3%. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
And you're listening to Agriculture Today. On now to this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Here's Marcia Boswell.
The U.S. and world wheat markets are seeing the tightest ending stocks-to-use ratios in nearly a decade, two driving factors behind higher average wheat prices. Kansas producers should keep a close eye on the factors behind these trends as they enter fall planting, according to Dan O'Brien, K-State Extension ag economist. O'Brien detailed the outlook for the grain market for 2021-2022 during the recent Risk and Profit Conference. The stocks-to-use ratio helps measure the interrelationship between the supply and demand of a commodity. The ratio measures a commodity's available stocks as a share of the commodity's use, both domestic and exports, for a marketing year. When supply is tight compared to demand, the ratio is lower, referred to as tighter, indicating prices should rise. In contrast, ample supplies compared to demand increase the ratio, indicating prices should be lower. For wheat, the U.S. market has the tightest ending stocks to use since the 2013-14 marketing year at 30%, driven by decreased production this year. Similarly, the world wheat market ending stocks to use is 21.5%, the tightest since the 07-08 marketing year. Both ratios correlate with higher average wheat farm prices, but the question remains if prices will stay high throughout the 2021-2022 growing season. O'Brien guided farmers to watch the release of the World Ag Supply and Demand, or WASDE, report. This monthly report will likely bring grain market volatility as data is gathered about further 2021 crop production declines, both decreased yields and abandoned acres from U.S. corn, soybean, and hard red spring in the northern states. Depending on the degree of the crop decline, the details in this report could be supportive to bullish. O'Brien said there is support from strong new crop futures and prospects for hard red winter wheat planting this fall, but there is strong competition for acreage from other crops. Still, soil moisture will likely be a key factor in which crop producers plant where, especially given the emergence of a La Niña weather pattern that could cause even drier conditions. Ultimately, O'Brien said the risk of wheat futures, along with corn and soybean futures, is less likely to fall sharply this fall due to tight beginning stocks. However, if crop prospects, both in the U.S. and abroad, become okay to good in 2022, prices will likely start to slide by late spring or early summer. Grain markets might also start to discount the risk of short crops in 2022. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. K-State's Mary Knapp on Kansas agricultural weather. That's coming your way next. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, our weekly look at Kansas agricultural weather and the very latest update from the Weather Data Library here at K-State. Across the way, Mary Knapp, climatologist with K-State Research and Extension. Mary, we are in the midst of the most widespread rain event that we've had for a while in Kansas.
Yes, it's certainly been a very widespread event. The interesting part is that the intensity has varied and the total amounts, but a large portion of the state is getting at least something. The amounts vary from as little as 0.15 of an inch to as much as 5 inches. So, again, quite widely varied. The one area that's still not seeing anything yet with these storms that have popped up overnight is the southeast part of the state. It's still not made its way into that area. We expect before the weekend is over that they'll get some of this moisture as well. And that's certainly been very welcome. August was dry when we look at it overall, and we're still getting the numbers in on that. But statewide, it'll be about in the bottom third as far as dryness goes for the state. Temperature-wise, it is slightly warmer than normal, but not excessively, despite the last week of August, which was about 7 to 8 degrees warmer than normal.
Thankfully, that has changed as well. But you mentioned those extremes on the moisture. There were some pretty impressive totals within that range, though.
Oh, yeah. There were quite a few areas, particularly in the center part of the state, that had 1.5 to 2 inches to 2.5 inches. At the Manhattan Agronomy Farm, we had 1.97 inches overnight. Ashland Bottoms was closer to 2.5 inches of rain. So, again, some very welcome numbers, and we'll get more as observers get a chance to get in and record that data and get it sent off. So we'll see when we do next week's summary just how well we fared with the moisture. And again, this is not the last of the rain. There's more expected tonight and possibly into Saturday night before the front moves out.
Hence the flash flood watches that have been already posted for a fairly sizable part of the state.
Right. People will be keeping their eyes on the rain gauge to see just how much accumulates and what kind of problems it might bring with it.
So what kicked all of this off? We know because of the high humidity in recent days that there was moisture flow from the southwest that was just poised for use, if you will. Then the right system moved through.
Right. To get a little bit of instability coupled with that abundant atmospheric moisture that was flowing in from the southwest, and that is what we need to trigger some storms. And September is the time of the year when we would expect that. We typically have a increase in the amount of moisture that we see in September as compared to August. So we'll definitely be looking forward to that again as producers are trying to get some of their fall crops in place, they'll need to have some moisture in the soil profile to get it going. Still a little bit early for harvest, so it won't complicate that too much yet. It's not likely to be of much benefit certainly for corn. That's already done and gone. Mm-hmm. There may be some sorghum and soybeans that still benefit from this moisture that are a little bit less advanced than others, but we're getting towards the end of both of those crops as well, so that moisture isn't going to make a huge turnaround in crop conditions.
So to break it down, what's ahead? More moisture this evening, possibility of added rainfall into the weekend, and then a brief dry stint?
Well, it may be longer than a brief dry stint. Both the 6 to 10 and the 8 to 14 call for warmer and drier than normal. A little bit stronger signal in that shorter term period. But again, the 8 to 14 carries us out to the 16th of September, middle of the month. So we would expect that after this, we're going to have a warm, dry spell to anchor the middle of the month. Keep in mind that we are moving into our fall season, and the normal highs continue to decrease as we go into September. So what is a warmer than normal temperature in mid-September is considerably cooler than a warmer than normal temperature in August. So it doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to get back to those 100-degree readings, but a 90 may be warmer than normal for the season.
And you say that there is a new experimental forecast tool out there looking at the likelihood of more rainfall for the latter part of the month as well. And it's saying things that may be counter to some other predictors.
Well, what we're looking at is the Climate Prediction Center's 3 to 4 week experimental forecast. And it's been operational for a couple of years. They just haven't moved it into an official product yet. It's still in the experimental mode as they're evaluating just how accurate it is. What it shows is a tendency for wetter than normal conditions across most of the high plains, and that's from Texas up to the Dakotas, and encompassing all but the extreme western part of Kansas. And by extreme western, I mean literally on the Colorado border. So we'll see if that actually validates. That would be a very timely period to get some increased rainfall. Again, that will be just as they're getting ready to plant winter wheat, canola, some of those fall planted crops, and a shot of moisture at that time could give a very good start to the year, which, given the pattern that we're looking at, which is signaling a La Nina developing, that is, as you noted, counter to what is a typical La Nina pattern of warmer and drier for our fall.
And a much better start to winter wheat than we saw last year in Kansas, if that materializes.
If that materializes, then we'd certainly welcome having that pattern. Again, a wet end to September would be beneficial.
Mary, we appreciate it. Thanks for coming over. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, Eric.
That's Mary Knapp, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension, on Kansas agricultural weather. Noting we will be away on Monday for the Labor Day holiday, but right back here on Tuesday. Please rejoin us then. Meantime, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good weekend for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.